that, Army, Navy, and Air Force, I guess Coast Guard too, are all under different sectors, are all under one command. They train together, they understand how to work together, and they're a lot more effective because of that. But let's go back to the movie. Now, the movie was interesting. It was somewhat accurate in some respects, but most of it was just a movie. It was a Hollywood. But let's deal with the Improvise issue. Anybody recall anything in the movie that was indicated what Improvise looked like or could be considered? Flashed, and I don't know how stealthy they were, but there were a couple of things that were true in the Operation Urgent Fury that were purely, improvised. And the movie, showed them, but they gave it the credit to the Marines as opposed to the Rangers that actually did it. The first thing is that when the Rangers were landed on the airfield they were supposed to take, they were sort of spread out all over the place, and it gave the Cubans and whoever else their time to sort of set up a defense. And so they were pinned down for a while, but there was there was a tractor. There was construction going on, so there was a tractor out there on the airfield. And one of the Rangers went out and hotwired that tractor and put it to good use. In the movie, you saw highways recon Marines hotwiring a tractor and taking out a machine gun nest. So that's pretty good improvisation. I mean, it's like not the kind of thing you see on a normal battlefield. So they improvised there. The other was also true that. Again, I think it was Rangers that were pinned down, maybe it was Marines, but they were pinned down, and in this building of some kind, it was actually a telephone in there, a live telephone. Unfortunately, the wires were cut, so I think they had to repair that. But okay, so they got a telephone. It's a commercial telephone. Well, how do we talk to command? How do we get somebody to, get these people off our backs and let us move on? So one of the I call them soldiers. I don't think it was a Marine. I think it was a Ranger. So one of the guys actually had, telephone credit cards, and he made a credit card call back to, I think it was someplace in Langley or the Pentagon or whatever. And after they kind of finally realized that it really was, a legitimate call, then they routed that back, and the cavalry came. Literally, I think it was helicopter gunships or something. Now, how often do you see something like that on a normal battlefield? I mean, that was definitely improvised. So I just wanted to give you some, some point of context as we move forward. Now let's go back a little bit through memory lane. So I'm not as old as Richard, but I'm close. Closer than I'd like, closer than I'd like to admit. So when I got out of college and with my first degree in '77, the big thing then was deregulation. So the petroleum industry was being deregulated. All the other industries are starting to become deregulated. So that really created a bit of a benefit. And then moving on to the '80s. What happened? Heavy industry started going to Japan. The steel industry, picked up and left, and the automobile industry was sort of crushed. And a lot of that had to do with just lack of leadership on our perspective in the U.S. There's a really good book, Richard Halberstam, I think, wrote it, called The Reckoning. And if you haven't read that book, you need to write it down and read it, because it was an excellent history of what happened to the rise and fall of the U.S. automobile industry and the fall and rise of the Japanese auto industry. Just terrific. So so that pretty much happened in the '80s, and that created a tremendous amount of disruption. We started getting corporate raiders. Yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. Absolutely. Yeah. So antitrust. Yeah. Well, about the same time, shortly thereafter, the whole concept of the conglomerate, was, I guess, debunked in effect. So instead of, you know, developing all this stability by having a lot of different brands under your umbrella that would kind of, you know, offset the risk of the market, well, gee, why don't you just let the investor, you know, buy their own portfolio and we can focus on what we do best. And that, I guess that was more Tom Peters towards the 90s. High tech exploded. Anybody recognize any of these? This one? You know, when I got out of school, that was what every financial analyst wanted. I mean, that was like the gold standard. And it, yeah, still is. The, so in 1977, the TRS-80 was introduced. Remember the TRS-80? And the, also the first Apple, I think, came out in 77. So, you know, the, what we have today, the laptops, I mean, but that was the technology. So, you know, we had some good years. Yeah, the 80s overall were pretty good. We, you know, we went through a change in the tax code and got out of the 18% interest rates, and business exploded. We had some other good years. The 90s weren't so bad. You know, he was an interesting guy, but the good news is that a lot of good things happened and, you know, set us up for a lot of prosperity. Towards the latter part of the 90s and the dot-com boom and everything, you know, that was unfortunate, but that was sort of an adjustment to, I guess it was like the, you know, the big tulip deal back in the Netherlands long before we were born. And then, you know, we had some tough years. Now, come on. I mean, if we survive the disco era, you know, we can survive anything. That was, you know, totally forgettable. So I guess the bottom line of that little trip through memory lane is, you know, we've really been adapting, improvising, you know, our entire career, haven't we? The, you know, back to what, you know, Richard's presentation, let's talk a little bit about what's changed now. What do we have to be? How do we have to approach the market? You've got millennials out there that everybody's, you know, concerned about ageism and how do you work with or for or manage millennials? How big an issue is that really, though?
So I'll take notes that way. It doesn't mean they don't want to. No, they haven't been trained properly or led properly in many instances.
Thank you. Well, and this is exactly on point, because remember the slide back a little bit where talked about high strategy, high touch requirements. The one benefit that, well, the one thing I tell baby boomers who are worried about, you know, ageism and everything is, forget about that. You know, take your skills and your experience and turn it into a strength. And one major strength that we've got, to your point, over the millennials is they're high tech, but they're not high touch. Their interpersonal skills and their communication skills are not so good in most cases. And so that's an area where, you know, we've got a tremendous advantage, and we can use that to help train, develop, lead these folks. You know, it reminds me, the other big question that, well, one of the biggest questions I get from folks asking why the recruiter doesn't call me back is that, you know, when we started our careers, we had sort of a metric about answering a phone call. If we couldn't answer the phone and we had to take a message, then we had a certain period of time where we had to make that call back. You know, it could be 24 hours, it could be less. So because the telephone was the primary way to communicate, unless you were face to face. Today, the telephone is a productivity tool. Okay, you might communicate with it, but it primarily is a productivity tool. I don't answer the phone for any number that I don't recognize. It goes into voicemail. And then afterwards, I decide, you know, is that somebody that I want to call back? oftentimes, it's solicitors that are trying to, sell me something, and it's easy to delete that. However, texting is like, hit a dopamine. You've got to respond to that text. And, it's even more, Richard probably can really help me with this one, because I am told, I've been married for 43 years. I don't know anything about, the current dating scene out there, but I am told by people that are in the scene, females especially, is that if, it's creepy for a woman nowadays to get a phone call from somebody they might have met, say at a function, a bar, or whatever. They find that creepy. On the other hand, text messages the way they like to communicate. Who knew? It's like,
helping solve problems.
so work ethic and problem solving skills are two big factors.
Those are the two big ones. I mean, we deal with a lot of gray things, a lot of gray area. We're analyzing things. Not a week goes by, we're like, oh, I've never seen this before. And
Right.
so often we're setting them off as the first line on, hey, can you go figure out how to calculate an after-tax return on this hedge fund? And they can't do it quickly. Some of them will be like, I couldn't figure this out. And then you sit with them and help them figure it out.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I like to tell folks is that, a lot of baby boomers coming out, especially if it's a Fortune 500 company, so all they've known in their career, so they want to kind of go back into that same environment. But the Fortune 500 has sort of a model they like to follow. They like to bring people in that they can train and they can mold and develop, that'll fit into their culture. I was with PepsiCo for a number of years, and Pepsi was great at that. But as you start to approach 40 years old, it was I think it was their management program to ensure that they didn't have to pay too much money in retirement benefits and pension. And so as you start to approach 40, they were sort of working you out. That's Fortune 500. But the Fortune 500, they're really focused overseas more than they are domestically for most of these companies. A lot of franchising companies that I worked with over the years, they sold off their company stores and turned them into franchise stores, so they could focus on international. So what I tell folks is that back to the disruptors, back to the emerging companies and the companies that are going into more rapid growth. That's where the opportunity is. Those folks value gray hair a lot more than they do, young kids with the technology skills. They want people that can help them get to the next level and have the battle scars and the experience to ensure that they do, as opposed to somebody that might be able to help them with an app but can't really figure out how to craft strategy.
I think you had mentioned earlier corporate development.
Right.
All of those areas, so that they can now wear multiple hats, as it were, for those smaller startup environments.
Right. So there's a much bigger premium, for baby boomers in emerging companies than even private equity guys. There are so many. It depends on the model that they follow, because some are like Berkshire Hathaway. Some follow that model. Few, the buy and hold. More people are into something they can buy cheap and sell dear and make a lot of money.